Hello and welcome to Top Story. US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates are in Moscow for 2 days of critical talks with their Russian counterparts Sergei Lavrov and Anatoly Serdyukov. The visit comes at a time of troubled relations between the two former Cold War sparring partners. They're expected to cover a range of issues on which Russia and the United States appear increasingly divided. Among them, Washington's plans for a missile defense system based in Poland and the Czech Republic, Russia's threat to suspend its participation in the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, the need for a successor to START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which expires in 2 years, and the resolution of Kosovo's final status. Russia purports to be particularly alarmed at the US missile defense plans in Central Europe, and in a counter-proposal suggested earlier this year that Moscow and Washington share the Karbala radar station based in Azerbaijan. The Russians are hoping the Moscow talks will provide a formal response to their proposal. Well, joining me now to discuss the talks is Bruno Gruzel, Head of Research at the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris and an expert on anti-missile defense. Thanks very much for being with us on Top Story. It does rather look as though this is mission impossible, doesn't it?
It looks like it. Actually, the Russians are quite opposed to any plan to implant missile defense systems in Europe, and especially in Poland and Czech Republic. So, yeah, it looks like mission impossible.
Earlier this year, President Putin made a particularly harsh speech in Munich about US foreign policy. And one of the central points that he was making was this anti-missile defense system that the Americans want to put in place in Poland and the Czech Republic. The Americans say they shouldn't be worried about it. It's only 10 interceptor missiles are going to be there. It's not going to affect the Russian missile defense system, which could flood it at any time it wanted to. So why are the Russians so alarmed?
I think, well, it's quite complicated a question, because actually part of it is due to the resurgence of the Russian power on the international scene, and which is actually carried by defense modernization in Russia, in the conventional and nuclear arena. So the Russians are trying to state that they are newcomers, quote-unquote, on the international scene. The second issue probably is the fact that it's Poland and the Czech Republic, so ex-allies.
Close to the Russian border.
Yeah, they're pretty much what Russia considered to be its natural extension of its power in Europe. So,
yet the Americans say that they're going out of their way to placate the Russians, asking them to participate in the project, to tour their sites in America to see what sort of weapon systems are going to be involved, and yet the Russians don't want to play ball. Why is that?
Well, again, I think it's much more a political statement than it is a technical one, as the Missile Defense Agency has repeated again and again. The capability of 10 interceptors in Poland to get to any nuclear strike from Russia is nil. I mean, Russia has still got some 1,500 nuclear warheads. It's quite enough to flood any system in Europe. So you have to take the assumption that Russia is making a point.
And as part of that point, it is suggested that perhaps the Americans would like to come on board with the idea of sharing a Russian-used radar station in Azerbaijan, the Karbala radar station, which is an old Soviet survival. The American response to that is it could be complementary to the existing, or to the planned system they have for the Czech Republic and Poland, but not an alternative to it. How do the Russians feel about that?
Well, there have been a lot of talks in NATO and bilaterally between Russia and the US to try to cooperate on missile defense. Actually, it's quite complicated. And as the Americans have stated, it's nearly impossible to replace the radar in the Czech Republic with the radar in Azerbaijan. They're all different
radar. Things altogether.
Yeah, and so I guess the Russians feel very frustrated at the Americans on that. But on the other hand, probably was a gesture to show that Well, they've tried, and the Americans didn't answer the right way.
But
So again,
the Russians also ridicule the raison d'être for the missile defense system planned in the Czech Republic and Poland, namely that it's there to protect Europe against future Iranian missiles. Do the Russians have a point there?
I don't think so. Frankly speaking, Iran have been developing missiles for more than 15 years now, and they're making good progress on having extended range missiles. So probably in the coming year they're already able to strike part of NATO, actually Turkey. It's probable that in the 10 to 15 years coming they'll be able to strike more in Europe.
Another big issue that's going to be discussed in the talks in Moscow is how to replace START, what to replace the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with when it expires in 2009. The Americans don't want a binding treaty, the Russians do. What's at the heart of the problem there?
Well, actually, the Russians and the Americans have concluded a treaty in 2002 in Moscow, which is called the SWORD Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty. And that will replace, to some extent, the fact to reduce the number of warheads in Russia and the United States. But what it will not replace is the confidence-building measures and verification measures that are embedded in START today, and that enables Russian and American experts to go to the other country and check that the actual reducing of nuclear warheads have been made. So actually the challenge here with replacement of START is rather in the verification measures that will be taken than in the reduction of warheads itself.
And there's also a problem with the conventional forces in Europe. Problems everywhere, it seems, at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think the Russians are pretty much right on the chase again. And well, the conventional forces in Europe treaty is a treaty that the Russians have criticized again and again, and not happy with it. And they're not happy with the...
And they're not happy that the US and NATO haven't ratified it yet as well.
Yeah, they're not happy with that. And they're not happy with another treaty that is important to Europe, which is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Okay, things don't look good in US-Russian relations at the moment. No. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thanks to Bruno Gruzel of the Foundation for Strategic Research. Join us again next week for another edition of Top Story. Have a good weekend.